Tita Franz, wala pa Tita Franz. Wala pa eh. Cannot be reached through Zoom. I move that instead we recognize the Honorable Kaloy. Oh, she's muted. May I please ask the technical staff to unmute
Thank you.
the distinguished lady from Gabriela Party List.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, she's there now.
Representative Rosas, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, may the good sponsor yield to some of my questions. Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, may you please recognize the distinguished sponsor of DOF, Congressman Swansing, to answer the questions.
Yes.
The time has already started, Mr. Speaker.
Yes. Representative Swansing has already been recognized. Your Honor, please proceed with the interpellation.
Mr. Speaker, before I answer the questions of the Honorable Congresswoman Rosas, may I first read my sponsorship speech, Mr. Speaker.
Yes. Yes, please proceed, Your Honor. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, my esteemed colleagues, and all our guests gathered physically and virtually, I am tasked to present to you the budget of Department of Finance and the tax agencies 2020. Never in our modern history has the Philippines faced COVID-19 apart from public health. This caused a worldwide economic contraction, a decrease in our revenues and foreign remittances, and also a stark decline in local economic activity. Each of these have their share in tempering our national economic forecast in the short term, in discouraging market and consumer confidence, and most importantly, in threatening the socio-economic well-being of our citizens. As our country tries to navigate through this unprecedented economic and financial upheaval, the Department of Finance is one of the agencies at the front lines steering our economy to safer ground. Early on, the DOF and its attached agencies recognized the potential compounding consequences of the pandemic and proactively crafted and implemented policies to mitigate the effects of widespread lockdowns on our local economic networks. In March, the DOF worked with Congress, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the NEDA, and other government agencies to formulate and enforce programs aiming to cushion the economic impact of the pandemic on the country, particularly for small business owners and average workers. Revenue-generating agencies also swiftly buckled down to ensure the availability of funds for our pandemic response. The Bureau of Internal Revenue and the Bureau of Customs expediently recalibrated revenue collection, enforcement, and administrative operations, resulting in a total revenue collection of 1.7 trillion pesos from January to July 2020, just 7% lower than the same period last year. Non-tax revenues also posted double-digit growth from January to July 2020, driven primarily by the Bureau of Treasury's revenue for the period, which grew by 87% year-on-year to 190.9 billion pesos. Moreover, the DOF has successfully secured supplementary financing sources to provide for the large expenditures needed to counter the adverse socio-economic impacts of the pandemic. The swift and purposeful actions of the Department of Finance during the early months of the pandemic were made possible by economic reforms that have been spearheaded by the department these past few years. Due in part to the partnership built by DOF and members of Congress, our economic managers have been able to prudently build the scaffolding for a sustainable economic expansion. The successful passage and implementation of tax reform initiatives have paved the way for better fiscal management and improved tax administration, resulting to a growing public revenue base along with our rapid economic growth rate of 6% per year during the decade. Before the pandemic, government revenues reached a record level of 16.1% of GDP, and our tax effort had reached 14.5%, the highest in 22 years. Moreover, in pursuit of more broad-based sustainable development, additional revenue from modernization, automation, and enforcement policies within the Bureau of Internal Revenue and the Bureau of Customs have buttressed expenditures for our build projects, universal health care, free college educations, for peace, and other social programs. These reforms have allowed us to rely more on our public revenue base for key development projects and averting potentially dire risk posed by over-reliance in the global credit market. While we now face challenges and uncertainties during this global public health crisis, the efforts of our economic managers and revenue collecting bodies have put us in a more stable footing than other developing countries during the course of this pandemic. While our ship was taken, indeed, we did not capsize. We have survived the initial onslaught by the pandemic or say this crisis will last well into 2021 and beyond. Therefore, as the Department of Finance has assumed a leading role in navigating us through uncertainties during this pandemic, now more than ever, it has to be empowered through its 18.28 billion peso budget for fiscal year 2021. In 2021, the DOF has a Herculean task of raising revenues of our continued COVID-19 response, of bringing our economy back on a road of recovery. This proposed budget will equip the department with the support necessary to build on its previous successes and accomplish this task, while managing threats of lower investment, higher unemployment, and slower progression in global trade and supply linkages. Empowering the DOF through its 2021 budget and by passing the Feast, Create, and Guide bills will also reestablish confidence in our markets and also appeal for the Bureau of Customs 2021 supplemental budget amounting to 4.4 billion pesos. As a response to direct instruction from the President, the Bureau of Customs has proposed programs within the supplementary budget in order to address systemic gaps in enforcement and implement programs for more efficient trade facilitation, border control, and revenue generation. Particularly, the creation of the Customs Border Protection Service will provide a controlled and timely response against smuggling and other fraudulent activities at our borders and other high-risk entry points around the country. The implementation of comprehensive baggage, container, and vessel inspection and monitoring systems will also aid the Bureau of Customs in continuing its commendable performance in apprehending illegal importations and shipments this calendar year, which as of September 20 has reached a total of 8.8 billion pesos. The construction of a new central office in Clark will, upon completion, further provide for more efficacious implementation of the Bureau's programs through a faster diffusion of responsibilities to local offices and quicker response by customs officials to issues that may arise in areas outside Manila. My esteemed colleagues, besides posing immediate health risks to our citizens, this pandemic has forced them to bleed their income streams dry to provide for their families. The precarious times we live in continually reduce the number of Filipinos families staying afloat from one day to the next. We cannot let such condition continue. We must provide our economy with stronger, rather, to keep us going through the challenges of these times. I thus seek your support for the approval of the budget of the Department of Finance and the attached agencies. With an empowered DOF, we have a better chance of fully riding out the storm we are in, of recovering and realizing our dreams for more prosperous, equitable, and dynamic Philippines. We have all been working toward the collective vision of every Filipino, matatag, maginhawa, at panatag ang buhay. This pandemic may have temporarily derailed us from this goal, but with empowered government agencies in 2021, we will reignite and keep aflame this hope for every Filipino. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Your Honor. We now recognize again Representative Arlene Brosas to interpellate our distinguished sponsor.
Thank you.
Yeah. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, a while ago we recognized the Honorable Brosas to interpellate and ask questions from the budget of DOF. If she withdraws her desire to interpolate for the meantime, we can recognize the distinguished minority leader. So it's up to the Honorable Brosas to withdraw her intent to interpolate for the meantime.
Yes. May we ask Representative Brosas if she would yield to the minority leader?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I will yield to the minority leader. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Speaker.
you. Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Speaker, I move we recognize the Honorable Minority Leader for his 30-minute interpellation. So moved, Mr. Speaker.
Our distinguished minority leader, Representative Benny Abante, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Congresswoman Brosas, for giving way to the minority leader. I would guess, Mr. Speaker, that our commissioners of the BIR are with us today through Zoom. Am I right, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Well, almost 7 months into the COVID-19 pandemic, and the government is low on funds. Now, this is an expected effect of the limited business operations and prolonged lockdowns. To collect additional revenue at the least administrative cost, the BIR issued Revenue Regulations number 2120, granting taxpayers the opportunity to self-assess their tax liabilities and pay any perceived deficiencies through what is termed to be the Voluntary Assessment and Payment Program, or VAPP, for taxable year 2018. In this program, taxpayers are allowed to self-assess and pay additional taxes without the participation of revenue officers. This way, the BIR will be able to collect as much taxes as it can without conducting actual audits, saving on personnel costs, while promoting the health and safety protocols mandated by the DOH and the IATF. In the present situation and without VAPP, when an audit is being conducted and the revenue officer discovers tax deficiencies, whether intentional or unintentional on the part of a taxpayer, and the revenue officer is corrupt or unscrupulous, the taxpayer will be at the mercy of the revenue officer. The taxpayer will be forced to pay a minimal deficiency tax to the government and a large portion of his supposed savings to the revenue officer, or as we call it, for the boys. If the VAPP is institutionalized as an amendment to the National Internal Revenue Code, the taxpayer will have the option to self-assess and voluntary pay deficient taxes even if there is an ongoing audit. This way, reason for the recent issuance of the Revenue Regulations number 21, 2020. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor.
Mr. Speaker, the program stated by the Honorable Minority Leader, as per BIR sources, is only temporary for the year 2018. It is not an amendment to the National Internal Revenue Code, Mr. Speaker.
So, when the VAPP was actually implemented, the BIR would say that this is a quick source of the revenue without personal audit by revenue officers.
That's correct, Mr. Speaker. For the
Now-
record, for the year 2019, BIR has collected from tax amnesty on delinquencies and estate tax amounting to 4.76 billion from 23,912 availers.
Okay? Now, kung wala po itong revenue regulation na ito, number 21, 2020, is there a way for taxpayers to self-assess and voluntarily pay their perceived deficiency taxes?
Mr. Speaker, the taxpayer can amend his revenue or BIR return as long as that period, within the period of 3 years, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, this regulation, Revenue Regulation 2021-2020, was only implemented once and it was not anymore implemented?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, for the year, only for the year 2018.
So it means that there will no longer be any time in which the Revenue Regulation number 21 to 2020 will again be implemented? Or is it only once? O tuloy-tuloy po ito, continuing po ito sa pangangailangan?
Mr. Speaker, it will only be implemented for the year 2018, and it will not be cascaded into the succeeding years.
So wala na po ito, this revenue regulation. Isa
Yes,
lang
Mr.
po ito,
Speaker.
bes. Wala na.
Wala na. 2018 lang, Mr. Speaker.
Now, I would like to find out why did the BIR put up
This was implemented only in 2018 because this is one of the quick sources of revenue collection for BIR, Mr. Speaker.
okay, without personal contact and communication with the revenue officers, is there a way to commit graft or corruption under Revenue Regulation number 21-2020? Is there any way?
Mr. Speaker, this is a voluntary self-assessment for taxpayer, and we would like to emphasize there is no contact policy prevailing right now in BIR, wherein the taxpayer or the revenue officer can interact with the taxpayer, Mr. Speaker.
Now, Mr. Speaker, I would think that this would be a good regulation. Would you think, Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, I agree, Mr. Speaker.
Now, if there is none to minimal corruption, because there is no contact or communication between the taxpayers and the revenue officer, Mr. Speaker, what would be the adverse effect of institutionalizing the voluntary assessment and payment program into a law, amending the National Internal Revenue Code?
Mr. Speaker, I was informed that BIR is now undergoing a lot of ICT or computerization programs within the Bureau. The purpose of this program is to minimize the contact between the revenue officers and the taxpayers. So I think the minority leader has a good point of why we should not continue the practice of this. But I was informed that these computer programs will address that problem, Mr. Speaker.
Therefore, Mr. Speaker, the regulation number 21-2020, the BIR is not amenable in putting that into a law of the NIRC.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. The BIR will implement or will incorporate this into the computer programs that are being implemented within the Bureau, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, if that is a good regulation to be able to minimize corruption, why would the BIR not be amenable for the voluntary assessment and payment program, which they themselves did, so we could be able to incorporate that into a law?
Well, I think, Mr. Speaker, BIR is is amenable to the suggestion of the minority leader. And I think I will personally communicate with the commissioner to look into this proposal, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, can we be provided with a copy of their proposal on how to be able to minimize corruption if they will no longer make use of the VAPP?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
We will
We
be
will
able
provide the honorable.
Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we expect the copy of their proposals on that. I'd like to let the BIR know, Mr. Speaker, that this representation is a very good taxpayer. Oo. Because I believe that taxes should really be paid in the most honest way. Now, may I inquire, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, if the Bureau of Internal Revenue has a record of their forfeited properties, assets, or FPA, and property, plant, and equipment, or PPE. Do you have a record, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Speaker, provide the honorable minority leader with the list.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, because this representation would like to request a copy of those documents. Because my next question will still be in relation to their forfeited properties assets, FPA or PPE. So the question is it true that you have an unrecognized FPA in the total amount of 431.037 million and 197.393 million in a total amount of 628.430 million? Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, per the record of BIR, there are 152 FPA items with total value of 417 million. The comment of the BIR is that these properties titled under the name of ROP with validated proof of ownership and supporting documents memorandum have been sent by FAMU to the concerned RRs that have physical jurisdiction of their properties for purposes of recognizing and recording these properties in the regional collection book. So, for a detailed listing of this, Mr. Speaker, will provide the minority leader of the composition of these 417 million properties, Mr. Speaker.
Because I would think, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, when it comes to the amount of 628.430 million, is the result of the understatement of the FPA, PPE, and the accumulated surplus.
Mr. Speaker, we'll just reconcile the amount with
Thank
that
you.
of the minority
Thank you.
leader.
If the BIR
Thank you.
can provide us a copy of those reports, we would really appreciate that. Now,
Yes.
is it correct, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, that the BIR have a double recording of buildings, information, and communications equipment in the total amount of 25.355 million. So it overstates the PPE and accumulated surplus accounts with the same amount. Mr. Speaker, Your Honor.
Mr. Speaker, BIR will reconcile the list with the list of the Honorable Minority Leader, so
Thank you,
that we
Mr.
will
Speaker.
determine whether there is a double recording or not, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, under the calendar year 2019, the BIR has a current year appropriations under the regular budget in the amount of 360,916,153. Now, this comprises the PS, the MOOE, the financial expenses, and capital outlays. Is this true and correct, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, the Bureau of Internal Revenue for the fiscal year 2020 GAA has 5.8 billion pesos for personnel services, 2.6 billion pesos for MOEE, 127 million for financial expenses, and 369 million for capital outlay, for the total of 9 billion 5 million, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, okay. So 9 billion, no?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now, if so, how much is the total obligations and disbursements under the regular budget?
Thank you.
The budget utilization rate of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, Mr. Speaker, is that for obligation or allotment versus obligations is equivalent to 53%, and the disbursement or obligations versus disbursement is 31%, Mr. Speaker.
And the amount would be, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman?
The amount is, for the allotment is 3 billion pesos, and for the obligation is 1.6 billion pesos, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Under the BIR, current year appropriations, the total amount of automatic appropriations is 463 million, 413,610, while the special purpose funds is 1,003,625,611. Now, if this is correct, how much is the total current year appropriations of the BIR under CY 2019, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman?
As of June 30, 2019, Mr. Speaker, BIR budget utilization rates stood at 51% for obligations and allotments and 76% for disbursement and obligations. In peso term, the total allotments amounted to 9.2 billion pesos, while total obligation amounted to 4.7 billion pesos, and total disbursement is 3.6 billion pesos. Mr. Speaker.
I have another two questions, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to wind up with my interpellation. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, I noticed that the total allotment of the BIR is 10,192,773,910.71, while the obligations is 9,563,386,276.98. Total disbursement of 8,497,520,535.75. Is this correct, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Speaker, we will just reconcile with the records of the minority leader with that of the record given to us by BIR for June 30, 2020 and June 30, 2019.
Mr. Speaker, Your Honor, can I be furnished a copy of those reports as to the physical and financials? Because I noticed that there are unreleased appropriations amounting to 111 million 3,301 with a total unobligated amount allotment of 571 million 312,144.85. So, ano po ang nangyari dito? If you can have a copy of that, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. We will provide the Honorable Minority Leader with detailed listing and with the management comment besides it.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, kaya ko po binanggit itong mga figures na ito sapagkat ang taong bayan po ngayon nanunood sa ating deliberation. At itong pera po ng BIR ay pera po ng taong bayan na katulad ko, katulad nyo, Mr. Speaker, katulad nyo po, Mr. Chair. So kinakailangan pong malaman ng taong bayan ang lahat ng mga bagay na ito upang at least mawala sa kanilang kaisipan na ang BIR pala ay kurap din. Nais natin na maging maganda ang posisyon ng BIR para sila ay makakolekta ng malaki para sa ating pamahalaan at para sa ating taong bayan, Mr. Speaker. Tama po ba ako, Mr. Speaker?
Tama po yun, Mr. Speaker.
Yeah.
And if I may add, Mr. Speaker, for the consumption of the Honorable Minority Leader, the amount of 572,129,000, yes, 572,129,000 earlier stated by the Honorable Minority Leader is for the retirement and life insurance premium. It was allocated to that account, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the commitment to give the copies of these reports, when we could be able to have it.
Mr. Speaker, the Bureau of Internal Revenue will furnish all the list and the requirements made by to satisfy the needs of the minority leader, Mr. Speaker.
When that, when will
By
that be,
Wednesday,
Mr. Speaker? When po? Kailan po?
This week.
This week. Okay.
Wednesday this week.
Is our good commissioner with us here in the plenary, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Chairman? Is the good commissioner of the BIR with us today in the plenary?
Ano?
Kasi hindi ko pa siya nakilala eh. Oo, gusto ko po siyang makilala eh. Can we please, if we may, can we be able to see her beautiful face, Mr. Speaker, Your Honor?
Yes, I will arrange such meeting, Mr. Speaker. I was informed a while ago that the good commissioner has this compromised.
Oh, so she
Status.
is not with us today.
Yes, maybe you.
Mr. Speaker, well, of course, we can always have a very good reason to absent ourselves in a very important budget deliberations in the plenary. Perhaps her good reason is valid, Mr. Speaker. Siguro kinakailangan po ang gawin ng ating good commissioner is for us to give us a record, including her bill of health, so that we will be able to know because, Mr. Speaker, this is a budget deliberation in the plenary. And she must be here even in the Zoom, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, Secretariat has just gave me the information that outsiders, aside from the member of the House, are not allowed to use the Zoom for disciplinary budget debates.
Mr. Speaker, I do not understand that because we have a monitor right there and the good commissioner can be in the Zoom, so she would be able to hear all of what we're talking about.
Monitor ng DBCC daw ito para sa sponsor. Wala sila, hindi sila allowed.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I demand that the Commissioner of the BIR speak to me personally. I demand that she ought to apologize to this Congress. I demand that she submit a record of her condition to this chamber, Mr. Speaker, or I will move for the deferment of this budget of the BIR.
Mr. Speaker, to give time to
Wala. Pero andyan nga ang Secretary of Finance, naka-off lang ang camera niya. Si Carlo Bello, Sec, andyan.
Andyan, di ba? Di ba dyan yan? Oo. Yan, di ba? Parang nandyan sila kahit wala sila dito. Wala. So post nandyan, naka-mute.
Nakamute lang sila. Commissioner.
Ito, Sec, ito eh.
Oo.
That is an insult to the state.
Ano sila? Nasa standby mo.
Actually, may choice tayo dito, boss.
Sa Zoom yata wala silang access. Pero I'm asking niya ba na yan?
Ito pala, ano?
Yeah.
So, kapag may tinatanong kayo, yan ang ano,
Yan yung pwedeng tumulong sa sagot.
tumutulong sa sponsor. Nilalagay nila yung sagot.
Dapat si
Yan yung ano nandiyan.
Defer natin yung BIR because I want those demands.
Pero, yung mga provision suspended tayo. Let's go. Meron, may mga tanong ka pa, boss?
Commissioner anong customs? Ituloy natin.
Sabi ni yung contact was Mike.
Pero, ano ba yun?
Everything except
Except BIR. Except BIR.
gigil kami. Okay kami lahat.
CRP yan.
Yeah.
Unti na
Session
lang.
resume.
Mr. Speaker,
Yes, Minority Leader, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, let me reiterate, and I'm winding up. I'm winding down. I demand, Mr. Speaker, that the Commissioner of BIR not being here should apologize to this chamber. And number two, I demand that she should go to my office and talk to me personally, Mr. Speaker. And number three, I demand that she bring to us a copy of her health condition. So we will know, Mr. Speaker. Wala man lang tayong ano dito. So, Mr. Speaker, to my regret, I move to defer the budget of the BIR, Mr. Speaker. Just the BIR.
Session suspended.
Amya? Okay, sige.
The last part na The last Session resumed.
Mr. Speaker, if we can again recognize our minority leader.
Mr. Speaker, at the
Mr.
proper
Minority.
time, I will be calling for a deferment of this budget of BIR, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. That is noted. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that we recognize the gentleman from the 1st District of Bohol for his interpellation, the Honorable Representative Edgar Chato. So move, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from Bohol, Representative Chato, is recognized.
Yes. Arlene.
After,
After na to, recognize ko si Arlene.
recognize lang, no?
Wala? Ayun na, ayun na.
Representative Chato, your Zoom is on mute. If you could unmute and proceed.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're coming in loud and clear, Your Honor. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And may I know, Mr. Speaker, if our central bank governor or the officials of central bank are on Zoom with us? Mr. Speaker.
I did not hear exactly what the question of the Honorable Chato, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I'm just inquiring if the Honorable Governor of the Central Bank is here with us, or the official.
BSP is not covered by the Department of Finance or considered as its attached agency, Mr. Speaker.
So when will be the appropriate time that we can raise questions on central bank matters, Mr. Speaker?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. When the DBCC budget hearing will resume, Mr. Speaker. BSP is under the BCC.
Thank you very much then, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Sponsor. I will register my manifestation at that proper time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chato. Thank you,
Thank you.
Speaker.
Thank you, Your Honor. Majority Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that we recognize the gentle lady from Gabriela Portelis, the Honorable Arlene D. Brosas, for her interpellation. I so move, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Rosas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the sponsor yield to some of my questions?
Gladly, Honorable Brosas.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, hindi po masama no, na umutang, lalo kung bumababa talaga yung revenues. Subalit natural nalilikha ng pagkabahala kung gabundok na yung utang. Lalo pa kung mamamayan ang pinapapasan natin ng pagbabayad. At hindi nararamdaman ang paggastos nito para sa mga kagyat na pangangailangan sa gitna ng pandemya, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, gusto nating ungkatin yung detalye hinggil sa domestic borrowing. Dahil batay sa datos, lumalabas na mas malaki ang bahagi ng total outstanding debt ng bansa ay domestic loans. Tama po ba ito, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor?
Tama po yun, Mr. Speaker. Ang ratio po as of now is 70-30 or more or less sa range na yan. 70% ang domestic borrowings and 30% sa foreign borrowings.
Mr. Speaker, yung domestic debt stock, 5.96 trillion ng July, tama po ba? And 6.41 trillion by August?
Let me see the data provided to us by DOF, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, while you are browsing on the details of the domestic debt stock, may I go on to my next question? Ang sunod ko pong tanong ay, may general characteristics o profile ba ang domestic lenders natin? Ibig sabihin, sa ang local entities tayo may pinakamalaking utang, kahit overview lang po.
Pwede pa po pakiulit ng question. Medyo choppy ang dating dito sa plenary, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I was asking about the general characteristics or profile ng domestic lenders. Ibig sabihin, sa ang mga local entities tayo, may pinakamalaking utang. Kahit yung overview lang po.
Mr. Speaker, as of August 20, the outstanding government securities issued by holder are as follows. The tax-exempt institutions represents 38%, the banks represents 37%, custodians represent 8%, insurance company represent 2%, private corporation 1%, and the rest comprise around 13%, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, yung characteristic o profile ng domestic lenders.
Ito po yung sinabi ko kanina, ito po yung domestic profile ng mga domestic lenders po. They are tax-exempt institutions, banks, custodians, insurance companies, private corporation, investment houses, and GOCCs, among others.
Alam niyo, Mr. Speaker, kaya natin tinatanong ito dahil posibleng through domestic debt market ang ruta ng mga Chinese loans. Ibig sabihin po, mas maaaring mas malaki yung aktual na pagkakautang natin sa China dahil ang kalakhan ay hidden debt at hindi bahagi ng officially reported na foreign loans. Now, is there a way for the Treasury or the DOF to track whether those who buy T-bills and other domestic debt instruments are linked to China or have any exposure to Chinese capital? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
According to the data provided to us, Mr. Speaker, the foreign investors represents more or less around 5% of the outstanding government securities holders, Mr. Speaker.
Yan po ang foreign loans, Mr. Speaker. Ito po yung tinatanong natin ay kung yung Chinese loans ay maaari silang nakakaruta sa pamamagitan ng pagbili ng T-bills and other domestic debt instruments na linked sa China o merong exposure sa Chinese capital. Meron po bang ganon, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
Mr. Speaker, they are considered as foreign investors, mga Chinese, and they represent only about 5% of the total shareholders of the outstanding government securities. So 5% lang po, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Brosas.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, sa ngayon po, tila dalawa lang yung publicized, no? The loan agreements with China. That is the 2.1 million for the river pump irrigation project and the 11.2 million for the new Centennial water source Kaliwang. China financing originally reported at 9 billion for flagship DPD projects. Tama po ba ito? Sa build projects po ito nakapaloob. Magkano na po ba yung total loans mula sa China? Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
Mr. Speaker, the latest loan provided by China through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is dated June 5, 2020, in the amount of $750 million or 37.5 billion pesos. There is a specific purpose for this loan, which is to combat the spread of the pandemic, provide social protection and relief to affected people February, November 15, and May 15 through May 15, 2032. So, ito po yung nakita po namin na latest na utang na binigay po ng China sa atin.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, may total na po ba tayo?
And also, Mr. Speaker, China infrastructure debt para sa big ticket items natin sa build totals to the amount of $250 million natin sa build projects. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While we are on that subject, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, kompletohin na po natin yung COVID-19 loans since inumpisahan niyo po yung AIIB. Batay po sa pinakahuling datos, tama po ba, nasa $7.734 billion na ang COVID-19 loans na nakuha ng pamahalaan, o roughly 386.7 billion in foreign loans. Tama po ba ang datos na ito o meron po bang bagong nadagdag, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor? Kasi ang meron lang po sa akin, yung Asian Development Bank, tama po ba ito? May 2.6, World Bank 1.3, AFD, Agency France Development.
For COVID-19 response, the total loans and grants as of this time amounted to 479 billion pesos, Mr. Speaker. I will also provide this list to the Honorable Congresswoman Arlene Brosas.
So mas malaki pa pala, Mr. Speaker, 479 billion ang foreign loans. Lahat po ba ito ay release na ng financing institution sa gobyerno? Natanggap na po ba natin ito?
Yung 479 billion pesos po in a grant na ito. Now I will just confirm with the Department of Finance kung talaga na-remit na itong amount na, total amount na ito, Mr. Speaker.
Sir, hindi pa Mr. Sponsor kung na-remit na yung...
Kasi may mga, sa listahan ko, may mga loans na-release na lang mga last month. So ito lang yung nakapending. Pero from those loans issued or granted before June 30, may listahan po ako. Yan sigurado pumasok na po ito sa atin.
June 30 onwards, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, yun yung meron kayo na datos na, no?
June 30, 2020 and before that. Pero
Indirectly related to supporting the infrastructure program or BBB of the Duterte administration. Natanong po natin to kasi ang budget priority number 1 pa rin yung build kahit na may pandemya. Napapahala po kami na malaking bahagi nito popondohan ng pautang.
Mr. Speaker, sa bagong datos na binigay sa akin ng DOF, of the total amount of 9.22 billion in budgetary support financing na atin na utang, to date po, a total of 7.55 billion has already been disbursed. So ibig sabihin, out of $9.2 billion, 7.5 na ang nagastos natin. And as of September 22, nagbago na po, meron nadagdagan po, nagiging $9.9 billion na ang nautang natin. But out of this $9.9 billion, 7.55 billion pa rin ang nagastos natin, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sagutin po natin yung tanong ko. Ang tanong ko po ay directly or indirectly related ba to supporting the infra program of BBB o Build ng Duterte administration, itong mga pondo na ito. Pwede pong pakisagot ng diretsyo kung may mga ginastos, no, na sa build na punta.
Pag budget support, yung sinabi mo kanina, $6 billion budget support kasi siya. So indirect.
Ito po, yung sinasabi ko po na 9.9 billion po, ito po yung tinatawag na budget support fund. So, hindi po natin alam kung saan gagastusin po itong 9.9 billion dollars. Posible po na lahat ito madala sa build projects natin o yung iba naman ay pwede natin idalin sa health, sa DSWD or sa iba man na agency na tumutugon sa COVID response, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, yung may mga key features and programs po, no, na financed by these loans. Dapat po familiar tayo dito. Dapat po alam ng mamamayan natin na kung ano yung pinagkagastusan. Dahil may mga conditionalities, yung mga loan agreements. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, tama po ba?
Pakiulit po yung tanong, Mr. Speaker. Kasi,
Mr. Speaker,
go ahead, Honorable Brosas, Mr. Speaker.
yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Sinabi niyo po kasi maaaring hindi pwedeng hindi inipon no? Hindi natin malalaman kung saan exactly yung mga expenditures. Very direct naman po yung tanong ko kung directly related ba ito in supporting the infra program of BBP, of the build projects, no? Yun po yung tanong ko Pero sinabi niyo po, very vague. Hindi niyo alam yung expenditure, maaaring sa iba-ibang napunta yan. Pero kailangan pong malaman kung saan pinagkagastusan. Kasi ang sinasabi niyo po, 7.5 billion ang disbursed na. Yan ang nagasta na. No? Ngayon po, sinasabi natin na dito sa mga loans na ito, may mga conditionalities sa mga loan agreements. Kaya mahalaga pong malaman ng mga mamamayan kung saan talaga napunta yung mga expenditures na ito.
Mr. Speaker, ito po, iba't ibang klaseng loans. May mga specific purposes po yung itong loans. May mga loans na ginagrant para sa COVID-19 response, para naman yung ibang loans para sa build, at saka sa iba pa. Ngayon, ang isang budgetary support na pwede natin identify, ito yung loans na galing sa ADB. Ito po yung in-expand po yung infrastructure program ng ating bansa. Ito po effective June 5, 2020. At saka ito specific ang amount na it is only up to 165 million ang pwede gastusin. At saka ito po nagastos na po natin. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, para po mabilis din, may we request the DOF or the Bureau of Treasury to provide us a copy of the loan agreements or loan covenants secured since January 2020. Mahalaga pong malaman ng taong bayan ng mga conditionalities na kakabit ng mga pautang na ito. Hanggang sa ngayon po kasi hindi pa rin kami nakakatanggap ng mga o nakakita ng mga pinirmahang kasunduan sa pautang, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
yes, Mr. Speaker, we will provide the Honorable Congresswoman Brosas with a list of all the loans and grants provided under the amount of 479 billion pesos. Mr. Speaker.
On to my next question, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Bahagi ng foreign loan financing na na-secure ng gobyerno, yung 750 million US dollars na nasa 37.5 billion from the China-backed Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank o AIIB, tama po ba? May collateral clause po ba ito gaya ng karaniwang pautang ng China o ng AIIB? Collateral clause po, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
Ito yung nabawasan na namin.
Yung sa datos na inahawakan namin po ngayon, nakalagay lang po siya as a budget support. So, bibigyan na lang po namin kopya si Honorable Congresswoman Brosas ng siguro yung purpose ng loan na ito. Kasi sa loan agreement makikita po ito yung specific purpose.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, kaya po natin tinatanong ito, maraming bansa na biktima po ng Chinese debt trap, yung tampok yung pagkawala ng mahalaga nilang assets dahil itinakda itong collateral as sa foreign loan. So nangangamba po tayo, kaya kailangan talagang makita natin specific yung mga loan agreements para malaman natin kung meron bang mga ganito, collateral clause. So, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, ngayon bahagi ng terms o expected outputs ng AIIB loan ay ang mga sumusunod. Nakalagay po dyan, by July 2020, the average turnaround time from sample collection results reduced to 48 hours or less. Kasi yung AIIB sa COVID response po ito, di ba? Sinabi nyo kanina. Nakalagay din dyan, by July 2020, emergency subsidy support provided for 13.6 million households. And by December 2020, 600 million US dollars of economic stimulus and support provided to high vulnerable sectors, including agriculture. Doon po sa turnaround, yung 48 hours or less, hindi po ito nakamit. Tama ba? Ano po ang magiging implikasyon nito?
Mr. Speaker, yung sinasabi kanina na 750 million na under sa AIIB, itong AIIB kasi it's a multilateral bank. Hindi lang po ito yung may-ari ang China. Maski ang Pilipinas po may kasama yun doon sa mga kapital. So, binigyan ako ng note na ito po ay hindi ma-consider na, Mr. Speaker. Ngayon sa tanong po sa bagong tanong ni Congresswoman Rosas, pinag-aaralan po namin yung datos kasi as of now, wala po kaming datos na pwede isagot sa katanungan niyo po.
Hindi niyo rin po masasagot, Mr. Sponsor, Mr. Speaker, yung next question ko. Ang next question ko po ay doon sa target output na by July na emergency subsidy for 13.6 million households, hindi ba't itong tinutukoy na second tranche ng SAP o Social Amelioration Program? Kasi halos pareho po ito ng coverage, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, under anong project po yung sinasabi ni Honorable Congresswoman Rosas? Ano ba yun?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, this is under the AIIB loan program ng COVID-19 response, active response and expenditure support o CARES program. Multilateral institution, AIIB, approved funding 750 million. Expected output po nakalagay the following. Kaya po natin tinatanong kung dahil hindi nga nakamit yung turnaround na 48 hours or less yung sample collection to results, may implikasyon ba ito? At ang second po nating tanong dyan, sa target sa July na emergency subsidy for 13.6 million households, hindi ba ito din yung second tranche ng SAP na tinukoy? Kasi halos pareho ang coverage, Mr. Speaker.
Sa unang tanong po, walang implikasyon po ito kasi it is already disbursed. These items are not condition precedent, Mr. Speaker. Ngayon yung sa pangalawang tanong, sinisilip ko po yung Bayanihan 2. Under sa Bayanihan 2, nakalagay po dito, yung mga kung saan ilalagay po yung 165 billion po natin. So, ang nakikita ko lang po dito, yung sa mga makaka-apekto agad sa mga kababayan po natin is yung cost for work and individual and involuntary separation na 13 billion. Yun lang po ang nakikita ko at saka yung sa DA direct cash subsidies na 24 billion, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, kailangan po nating iklaro, no? Ibig sabihin nito, yung bahagi ng 200 billion, yung Social Amelioration Program ay pinondohan ng utang panlabas. at hindi ng realignments mula sa fiscal year 2019 at 2020 budget. Ibig sabihin, may hindi po ba ginastos doon sa original na inirelease ng DBM sa DSWD na 200 billion para sa emergency subsidy program. Kasi kung ito pala ay kung ginamit yung utang for SAP, so meron pa originally, no? Or meron pang pondo na hawak ngayon for social amelioration program. Tama po ba, Mr. Sponsor?
Mr. Speaker, yung ng SAP ay hindi po galing sa 750 million na support fund ng AIIB. Pangalawa po, yung 6 billion emergency subsidy under DSWD in Bayanihan 2 is not sourced from foreign loans and foreign financing, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor. Tama po na iklaro. Kung ganun po, paano pinatupad yung specific program sa AIIB loan for economic stimulus and support? Tapos ano na po ang completion status nito? Sino-sino po yung mga naging beneficiaryo?
Gusto ko lang po, I would like to reiterate na ito po ay budget support lang. Yung loan na nakuha po natin sa AIIB is a budget support. Wala po siyang specific purpose kung saan po gagastusin ito.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, walang specific purpose, wala po tayong breakdown, wala po tayong report ng pinagkagastusan ng AIIB loan at kung ano na ang status nito.
Ito po yung loan. Isa po ito sa mga loans na ginagamit po natin sa basic financing formula. Yung hindi makayanan po ng atin ng revenues, yung parang nagkakaroon po ng deficit, so magkakaroon tayo ng loans, borrowings. So yung sinasabi natin na nakakuha tayo ng AIIB na 750 million loan, ito po ay budgetary support para sa kadagdagan po sa kulang po natin sa revenue collection.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, so wala po tayong particularities ng loan na iyan na pwedeng sabihin ngayon. Kung sino ang nakinabang, ano nga po ang status.
Wala po, Mr. Speaker, kasi budget support fund po siya. Pumasok po siya doon sa budget support fund, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor, kaya po natin kinaklaro yan. May mga ganito pala tayong programa, no, inuutang ng gobyerno, pero hindi maramdaman ng mamamayan o wala nga tayong maibigay na detalye. Yung second tranche nga ng SAP, no, dapat Mayo pa yun natapos pero hanggang ngayon hindi pa rin nakukumpleto at hindi pa rin nabibigyan ng lahat ng beneficiaries. Napakahalaga po na maisapubliko yung mga loan agreements na pinapasok ng pamahalaan sa panahon ng pandemya. Kung paano po ito ginagastos, yun po yung napakahalaga na malaman ng ating mamamayan. Utang ito napapasanin po ng mamamayan sa forma ng mga buwis. And it's bare minimum for the people to know the conditionalities and programs under these loans. Sabi nga ng DOF, asahan daw ng mamamayang Pilipino ang mga panibagong buwis hanggang 2022. Mamamayan pa rin ang pagbabayarin sa mga inutang na hindi naman nila nararamdaman. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Sponsor.
Before the...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's my last manifestation.
Okay. Would the sponsor care to respond?
Noted po, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
We will furnish Honorable Congresswoman Brosas, of all the list of loans and grants taken during this year.
Representative Atienza is recognized to interpolate the sponsor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader, for the kind indulgence of the sponsor. We would like to clarify certain matters relevant to our financial condition.
I would gladly answer all the questions made by Honorable Congressman Atienza, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I think there's a little confusion going on. We made the commissioner of BIR a she when he is a he, and the gentleman has just identified me as a she. No, I am a he. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, kidding aside, alam po ninyo ang tanong ng marami ngayon, utang kayo ng utang sa Kongreso. Basta kayo ng pasa ng batas, uutangin pa ang pera. So may I be enlightened, Mr. Speaker, through the gentleman who's representing the Department of Finance tonight, ano po ba ang limitasyon ng pag-utang panlabas, panloob, with regards to the appropriations needed for our different legislations in this chamber?
Mr. Speaker, we're just being guided with a simple formula. Meron po tayo proposed total budget for the year, tapos may program po tayo na tax revenues, revenue collections. So ang pagkukulang po noon ay pupunuin na po natin ng borrowings locally at saka ng foreign borrowings natin, Mr. Speaker.
Again, I will rephrase my question. Is there any limitation as to how much we can borrow to support a proposed law in this chamber? Is there a limit or there's no limit? We can borrow anything, no matter how much, in the pursuit of a proposed beneficial law.
Ang tinitingnan po natin dito, Mr. Speaker, ay yung amount of deficit in a certain period po. For example, for this year, 2020. Yung kulang po na yon, yung hindi mapunuan ng revenue collection natin, ay yun po ang parang pinakasiling po ng uutangin natin for the year, Mr. Speaker. And you cannot exceed po the budget. So bali yung budget natin, kunwari ngayon 4.5 trillion. Tapos ang revenue collection lang na program here is around mga 3.8. So ang utangin po natin is 1.2 trillion pesos, Mr. Speaker.
My question is, if we have a proposed law which needs financial support, is there a law that says we should not consider the law first until the sourcing of fund is established? In other words, we cannot just say funds needed for this law would be borrowed without any other requirements. Tama po ba yung aming impression o mali?
new revenue or funds available dito from the budget. So yun yung nakalagay sa Constitution kapag meron sa expenditure bill in addition to PAA. So if it's over and above the PAA,
So, yung law, law passed, kailangan.
pero pwede siyang unfunded. Wala pong revenue.
Ay pwede po na magkakaroon ng kasi every expenditure po sa law natin ay kailangan may corresponding revenue. So, yun ang sinasabi na kailangan may mapagkukunan po tayo para pambayad sa law na gagawin natin para sa expenditure po.
Yun din po ang pagkaalam ng inyong lingkod, whether it's a congressional act, a local government ordinance, a barangay appropriation act, lahat po ito ay kailangan may pagkukunan ng pera. Hindi pwedeng ordinansa, whether local government or barangay ordinance, na wala pong pera. In that manner, people will be expecting so much, but there is none coming. At saka meron pong illegality yun, di po ba?
Tama po yun. Sa bawat po law natin na magkakaroon ng ceiling para sa pangungutang, kailangan may corresponding po na pagkukuhanan ng revenue po at saka pondo na pambayad po sa utang natin, Mr. Speaker.
So ano ang posisyon ng Department of Finance, Mr. Speaker, on the two laws which we call economic stimulus laws? Ito po yung arise at saka yung cures na wala pong pondo. Utangin pa lang ang pagsuporta dito sa mga magandang layuning mga batas nito. Ano po opinion ng Department of Finance dito?
The position of the Department of Finance, Mr. Speaker, ay gusto po nila bayanihan tulang muna ang implement natin kasi wala pa daw tayo mapagkukunan ng para doon sa arise bill or under the guide bill po.
So therefore, the Department of Finance is not fully supportive of the passage of these two laws until we are able to guarantee or at least assure ourselves of the ability to pay whatever is going to be borrowed. For ourselves of the ability to pay whatever is going to be borrowed. Am I to take it rightly that the Department of Finance is not in full accord at this point yet?
Kasi po may limitasyon po ang constitution natin. Ang nakalagay po doon, kailangan po na may mapagkukunan po tayo. Kung may bagong programa po, kailangan po meron tayo ang excess funds or excess funds. Hindi po tayo pwede umutang po ng bagong utang para po sa bagong programa. So, kung may sobra po tayo na pondo, pwede daw itong arise, pero pag wala po, ang recommendation po ng DOF, huwag muna po.
I was waiting for that, Mr. Speaker, because I know very well that the government does not have that power under the Constitution to just keep on appropriating without sourcing. So we need to source the funds before we get our people excited about the so-called economic stimulus Appropriations Act. Tama po ba yun?
Tama po yun, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I'd like to shift to the present condition. As you said, the Appropriations Act for 2021 is not fully covered by expected collection. So we need to borrow again.
Tama po yun, Mr. Speaker.
In other words, kailangan malaman ng ating mga mamamayan tayo na marahil 2 hanggang 3 trilyon salapi para po naman mapunuan itong ating layunin sa isang budget na tutugon sa mga problema ng ating bansa sa kasalukuyan. So they have to shoulder that responsibility. But on the other hand, they are shouting back. Why don't you collect more taxes? Tanong saan kukunin ang pera? Ang sagot ng marami, aba, dilinisin ninyo ang customs. According to the World Bank, we're missing about 200 billion every year just from that one source of revenue-raising agency. What is our effort at the moment to get the Customs Commission perform better?
Yung revenue collections po ng BIR at saka BOC po, as of July 30, ay over the target po sila, yung sa revised target po. Yung BIR is nagkaroon po ng positive deviation of 2.8% versus the first semester target. At saka yung customs po ay halos 1% over the target po. Yun ang tax effort na ginawa po ng dalawang bureau natin.
At this juncture, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to be clarified from the point of view of the Customs Commission. I'd like to ask a question as simple as it may seem. Why is the Customs Bureau not implementing Customs Modernization Act so that all containers coming into the country every day are taxed properly? And I would like to add another question along that line. Ilan po bang container vans ang pumapasok sa bansa araw-araw, Mr. Speaker?
X-ray? Hindi lang X-ray, the whole modernization. Modernization, sir. Operations, organization, ICT, modernization. Mr. Speaker, around 12 to 15,000 containers enters the Philippine ports every day, Mr. Speaker. And at this point in time, Mr. Speaker, there is negotiations for 88 million for modernization of the Customs Bureau. This includes the ICT projects for the risk management, additional X-ray machines, and other human resource program, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I've heard